Adolf Hitler's decision to invade the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, represents one of the most crucial inflection points in World War II, and possibly the most catastrophic strategic error in modern military history. Operation Barbarossa, named after the Emperor of the Holy Roman Germanic Empire, it was not just a poorly calculated military campaign, but the manifestation of a racial and geopolitical ideology that would eventually consume the regime that conceived it. To understand the magnitude of this strategic error, it is essential to examine the fundamental motivations that led Hitler to this fatal decision. The Führer had never hidden its belief that the Soviet Union would be the definitive enemy of its regime. His hatred of communism was visceral and ideological, but there was also a pragmatic dimension in his obsession. The vast open spaces and the abundant natural resources of Soviet Russia represented the award that would finally allow the German people to become the Lord people that their racial ideology promised. During the first months of 1941, while remained in Berghof, his retreat in the country in the Bavarian mountains, Hitler planned the one that would be his biggest bet. Operation Barbarossa was not only a military invasion, but the realization of a geopolitical dream that combined territorial expansionism, racial ideology, and economic needs in a single continental endeavor. The plan involved the unfolding of more than 4 million men, supported by more than 3,000 aircraft, in 3 simultaneous onslaught that should definitely break the Soviet power. The German strategy was based on the Blitzkrieg doctrine that had been so effective in Poland, France, and Balkans. The North Army Group should master the Baltic states and capture Leningrad. The Center Army Group would advance toward Moscow, while the South Army Group would occupy Ukraine. This division of forces into 3 main axes would prove to be one of the fundamental flaws of the plan, distributing German combat power so that it prevented the decisive concentration of strength in any unique objective. German generals were silent when Hitler showed them the plan, concerned with their excessive ambition and the risk of dispersing their forces very broadly. However, none dared to express his doubts openly, illustrating the atmosphere of intimidation and the absolute centralization of the decision, making power that characterized the Nazi regime. This dynamic of power would be a constant factor throughout the campaign, with devastating consequences for the strategic driving of war. Soviet numerical superiority was overwhelming in absolute terms. The Red Army had nearly 2 million men at a Western Front attack and millions more in reserve. The Russians also had over 20,000 tanks, far surpassing the 6,000 Germans. Although they were older and less powerful, they still constituted a formidable force. The crucial issue for Germany was whether its higher technology and speed could subdue the Russians before the vast numbers of the Red Army crushed them. However, the apparent Soviet numerical force hid a deep and systematic weakness. The mighty Red Army, once the largest and most technologically advanced in the world, had been devastated by Stalin's purges in the late 1930s. About 3/4 of his upper officers had been shot or arrested. Despite appearances, a catastrophic collapse had occurred in morals and efficiency. This situation created a window of opportunity that Hitler intended to explore, but also introduced elements of unpredictability that German planning could not properly anticipate. Stalin, desperate to maintain peace, had given orders to do nothing to offend Hitler, even as German soldiers flooded the neighboring Poland. This defensive and almost submissive stance of the Soviet leader reflected both his understanding of the military vulnerability of his country and his political calculation that the war could be postponed until the Soviet Union was better prepared. Before you can advance to Russia, Hitler needed to protect his south flank. Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary were firm allies of Germany, But in March 1941, the Yugoslavo government, which was friendly to Germany, was overthrown by pro-British forces. Its neighbor, Greece, was also pro-British. This situation forced Hitler to a preliminary operation in the Balkans that, although well successful, it consumed precious time and resources that would be crucial to Barbaross's success. The German invasion of the Balkans on April 6, 1941, was performed with the characteristic efficiency of the German military machine. 33 German divisions advanced over Yugoslavia, quickly shattering their defenses. Belgrade surrendered on April 12th, and Greece fell almost so quickly. Despite the British aid, Athens was captured in less than 3 weeks. Although this campaign was a tactical success, it had significant strategic consequences for Barbarossa, delaying its beginning in crucial weeks that would prove vital when the Russian winter arrived earlier than expected. When Operation Barbarossa finally began at 3:15 a.m. on June 22, 1941, Luftwaffe joined the dawn, aiming at the Soviet aviation fields, while the land attack was simultaneously began. The Germans quickly crossed the Bug River on the border between Poland and the Soviet Union, with Hitler's panzers soon penetrating deeply in the Soviet territory. The initial success was impressive and seemed to validate the most optimistic expectations of the German command. In 2 days, the panzers had penetrated more than 50 miles. Against coordinated attacks of the Red Army were quickly repelled, and tens of thousands of Soviet prisoners were captured. Luftwaffe had established full dominance in the air, and the Red Army's leadership seemed paralyzed by the German attack. The first great tactical hit came on June 29th, 7 days after the beginning of the attack, when 2 panzer attacks were near Minsk, surrounding huge pockets of Soviet troops. As the support infantry arrived, more than 300,000 prisoners were captured. This victory seemed to confirm the feasibility of the German strategy and the possibility of a quick and decisive victory. In many areas, especially in Ukraine, Germans were greeted as libertadores, where anti-Russian feeling was widespread. This initial reception created a false feeling that the Soviet population would rise in mass against the Stalin regime, an expectation that would prove tragically wrong as the brutal nature of the German occupation became apparent. In Moscow, Stalin seemed to be almost total collapse with the news of his betrayal for Hitler. He remained silent for more than a week, not appealing to the patriotism of his people to save the homeland mother until July 3rd. This initial reaction of Stalin illustrates both personal shock and institutional paralysis that characterized the initial Soviet response to the invasion. The British reaction to Operation Barbarossa was drastically different. The First Minister Winston Churchill received news of the invasion with very different feelings. It meant that the country was no longer alone. He announced that any Nazi Germany enemy was a friend of Britain, regardless of the political differences of the past, and sent a mission to Moscow to sign a mutual assistance treaty with Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov. However, in addition to sending help by sea, there was little that Britain could immediately do to help the Soviet Union. As June became July, the German blitzkrieg cut the Soviet territory more deeply, and it began to seem that nothing could stop Hitler. However, he was about to make his first big strategic error. In early July 1941, more than 300,000 Red Army troops were surrounded west of Minsk. Hitler's panzer commanders, in particular General Heinz Guderian, begged to be allowed to continue advancing. Operation Barbarossa was acting like a watch. In a week, the panzers were in Smolensk, deeply inside Russia, and only a few hundred Moscow miles. On July 22nd, a panzer tweezers movement found the east of Smolensk, holding another 310,000 Soviet troops. There was a brief break, as long as the rest of the army reached. Although the tanks could move the spectacular speed, Most of the army still had to walk or depend on horses, pulled transportation. Moscow was now just 200 miles away, and the road was open. It seemed certain that it would fall until the end of the summer as planned. However, elsewhere, German advance was encouraging increasing difficulties. The Red Army was counterattacking more effectively, and in mid-July, the Southern Army Group was still more than 50 miles from Kiev. It was at this crucial point that Hitler made one of the most controversial and potentially fateful decisions of the entire campaign. He decided that Guderian's panzers should delay his advancement over Moscow and turn south toward Kiev to provide help. Guderian objected vehemently, but Hitler was adamant. There should be no further advance on Moscow until Kiev had fallen. This decision would prove to be fateful, fundamentally altering the pace and focus of the campaign at a time when speed was essential. There were already worrying signs that the Red Army would not be the easy opponent Hitler expected. Soviet human power seemed infinite, with over 16 million troops now mobilized. The Red Army also had some new formidable weapons, in particular a new tank, the 37-ton T-34, which had a 76mm cannon and was faster and better on irregular ground than Panzer Mark IV. However, while Blitzkrieg continued, it was easy to lose warning signs. The Panzer Group of Guderian began its south attack on August 23, 1941, with the panzers of the South Army Group attacking north 3 weeks later. The Tweezers met east of Kiev on September 16th, completely destroying 2 additional Soviet armies and resulting in the death or capture of 500,000 men. On the same day, more than 1,000 miles to the North Army Group surrounded the city of Leningrad, present-day St. Petersburg, cutting immediately from the rest of the Soviet Union. Hitler decided not to take the city of robbery, and the German troops settled to make it unhooked until the surrender. Conditions in the city have become terrible, with only a small amount of food and can enter water through Lake Side to the east. Hunger quickly settled in Leningrad. More than 11,000 people died in November, and only in December an ice road could be opened through the lake, allowing a slight increase in feed. However, 3,700 people starved on a single day of December. Leningrad's siege would become one of the most tragic and heroic episodes of the whole war, demonstrating both the brutality of the German strategy and the extraordinary resistance of the Soviet people. Meanwhile, the Centro Army Group prepared for the final robbery of Moscow, with the panzers of Guderian having met him to lead Blitzkrieg. The Germans had superiority from 2-1 in tanks and men in front, and 3-1 in aircraft. The attack began on September 20th, 1941, and once again, Guderian's panzers cut deeply through the Red Army. On October 7th, more Soviet troops were surrounded, but Stalin was determined to defend Moscow to the last man. He named Marshal Georgy Zhukov to organize the city's defense, and the people of Moscow were mobilized to dig a series of defensive lines. However, the real obstacle to German advance would be the climate. On October 8th, heavy rain began to fall. The German vehicles soon got jammed in a sea of mud. At the end of October, the terrible time and an increasingly obstinate Soviet resistance meant that the Centro Army Group was still about 50 miles below Moscow. Hitler was finally paying the price for his previous decision in the year of delaying his advance on Moscow. The weather was now starting to freeze, and the German forces, confident that the campaign would end in the summer, were taken unprepared. Without winter clothes, they now suffered terribly. In front of Moscow, the Centro Army Group was starting its final impulse to capture the Soviet capital. On December 4th, its leading units were only 19 miles from Red Square. Some recognition patrols claimed that they could see Kremlin's gold domes shining at a distance. But that night, the temperature plummeted again. Tank engines did not work, weapons frozen, and many soldiers suffered severe cold burns. On December 5th, the Germans interrupted the attack. Winter had reached the Red Army's rescue, but the Germans were confident that with the arrival of spring could finish their work. This confidence would prove profoundly mistaken, as it underestimated both the ability to recover Soviet and the consequences of their own previous strategic decisions. For much of the fall of 1941, Stalin's armies staggered under the German attack, but all the time he had another concern: that the Japanese would attack their strength in Siberia. In November, however, the Soviet dictator received a message from his main spy in Japan, ensuring that the Japanese had no such intention. Immediately, more than 30 divisions began to move west along the Trans-Siberian Railroad to Moscow. They were well-equipped and well-trained in winter combat. In early December, more than 500,000 extra men were in a position near the capital, representing a strategic reserve that the Germans had not anticipated. On December 5th, just when the Germans were leaving their attempt to capture Moscow, they were hit by a wild Russian attack. First came a massive bombardment of Soviet artillery, followed by swarms of Soviet T-34s that crossed the German defenses. Stunned by the savagery of the attack of an enemy who had taken over, the Germans retreated. For the next 7 days, Soviet troops shattered the German forces. For Hitler, who only reluctantly had agreed to stop the attack on Moscow, it was a terrible blow. On December 19th, he dismissed his commander-head general, Marshal Walter von Brauchitsch, and took command personally. Heinz Guderian was also fired along with 35 other upper officers. Hitler has now ordered that there would be no more withdrawals. German troops should fight and, if necessary, die where they were. It worked. The German line gradually stabilized. However, Stalin, euphoric with the success of the Red Army, has now required a massive advance throughout the front. Marshal Zhukov, one of Stalin's most trusted commanders, tried to dissuade him, but Stalin was determined. For the next 4 months, the fight was inconclusively around German defensive positions. For Hitler, this was a very uncomfortable situation. He was used to it and expected quick results. But now, he was dangerously jammed in the Soviet Union, facing an enemy who never seemed to give up. Russia was not his only headache. On December 7th, 1941, the ally of Germany, Japan, attacked the United States without warning. Hitler, almost without thinking, he also declared war on the United States, assuming a new massive enemy without advanced planning. This impulsive decision exponentially multiplied the strategic challenges faced by Germany. As 1941 became 1942, Hitler remained determined to return to the offensive in Russia. But I needed a new strategy. The original plan to fight across the front was no longer viable. Moreover, as his economic counselors told him, Germany's oil supplies were running out. Then he decided to interrupt the attacks in the north and instead go to the petroliferous fields of Russia in the south. The initial plan for Operation Blue, as it was called, predicted an attack south of Kharkov, with the Army Group descending it to capture the oil fields, while the Army Group B covered its flank along the Don River. Immediately there was a brutal meeting with the Soviet forces trying to resume Kharkov, resulting in the capture of another 200,000 Soviet troops and the death of 70,000. As part of the same operation, the Germans squeezed their siege to the port of Sebastopol in Crimea. For 8 months, defenders were under constant bombing of the German artillery, including a massive rail cannon of 400 millimeters. At the end of June 1942, Sebastopol finally fell to the Germans, and now it was safe to go to the oil fields. On June 28th, the offensive began. The Army Group B forced its way to the Don River and advanced throughout its western bank. The Army Group faced her stronger resistance, but on July 9th, she was close to Rostov. It was then that Hitler made a series of what would prove to be serious strategic errors. According to the Army B Group made its way through Don, the Führer ordered it to capture Stalingrad, although the city had no immediate strategic meaning. The army had suddenly been given a new, massive task. 2 weeks later, Hitler aggravated his judgment error. Frustrated with the slow progress of the campaign in Caucasus, he diverted most of his panzers to the mountains. The march over Stalingrad decreased notably. The reinforced Army Group A now ran through the Caucasus up to 70 miles of the Caspian, threatening to cut all the Soviet armies in the area. But then Hitler changed his mind again. Enraged by the slow progress of the Army B Group to Stalingrad, he has now ordered the panzers to return to the north. On August 9th, the Army Group captured the first of the southern petroliferous fields. In Maikop, found them completely destroyed, but without reinforcements he could not go further, and the huge oil fields in the central Caucasus and those near the Caspian Sea remained out of reach. But Hitler's attention had changed again. This time to Stalingrad. At the end of August, German forces were at the Stalingrad attack distance. The attack on the city, which bearing the name of Hitler's enemy, had begun. It would be one of the most crucial battles in World War II, representing not only a military confrontation, but a symbol of the Soviet determination of resisting the German invasion at any cost. On August 17, 1942, General Friedrich Paulus's Sixth Army crossed Don and began a final momentum on Stalingrad. 6 days later, a panzer onslaught had reached the Volga River north of the city, and the German forces were fighting in the external suburbs. Hitler looked on the brink of a famous victory. Stalingrad was an important industrial center that stretched over 12 miles along the West Bank. Its factories produced more than a quarter of the Soviet Union tractors and trucks, as well as tanks and weapons. The Russian people had turned them into a formidable fortress, helped by Hitler's decision to send the panzers from the South Army Group B, which gave them 2 more weeks to prepare. The German plan was to make a direct attack on the city. Now, one of the most prolonged and intense battles of World War II has begun. Slowly, the Germans advanced street by street, with bombers Stuka bombarding right in front of them. The fight was wild, home by home, room for room. Soviet defenders used sewers for shelter and communications, and the above ruins for gunmen. Russian reinforcements had to be brought through the river, often under airstrike, but even so, thousands passed. At the end of September, the Germans had opened their way through most of the city, almost to Volga. For Hitler, Stalingrad capture was now an obsession. On October 4, 1942, General Paulus launched what should be the final attack on Stalingrad. Tanks led the way, passing the rubble and firing at the burning Arpa in courtyards. A German officer said, "The advance is measured in corpses, not meters." The German victory seemed right, but in fact, the Germans were dangerously overrested. In mid-November, the Soviet army was bringing reinforcements. More than 1 million troops, 30-400 cannons, 900 tanks and more than 1,000 aircraft were secretly moved to the battle zone. On November 19th, they attacked the German northern flank. After a massive artillery bombardment, T-34s and assault infantry exploded through German positions. Now it was the Germans who surrendered to the thousands. The next day, a Soviet attack in the south was equally well successful, and on November 23rd, these forceps movements were west of Stalingrad, cutting the 6th German Army. General Paulus, responsible for the German forces, could have escaped, but Hitler ordered him to remain and fight. The Führer had been secured by Luftwaffe that sufficient supplies could be transported by air to Stalingrad. This was enough for him to announce that German positions should resist until rescued. To help Paulus, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, the general German commander in the region, launched Operation Winterstorm on December 12th. It was an attempt by the German panzers to break the city's Soviet siege. For 2 days it went well, but then the resistance of the Red Army increased. On December 23rd, the attempted German rescue had stopped about 30 miles from the city. Manstein advised the besieged. Paulus trying to escape Stalingrad, but Paulus wanted Hitler's permission. This was rejected, and it was probably too late anyway. Marshal Zhukov has now triggered the next stage of his master plan, a massive attack on the Panzer relief operation. The panzers were pushed away from the city, and at the end of December, all hope of helping German forces in Stalingrad had disappeared. Worse yet, the plans to transport air aid to the city were a fiasco. German troops needed 700 tons of supplies a day to survive, but never received more than 80. The weather was very bad, and the Red Air Force now commanded the skies. Steadily, the Soviet troops tightened the siege of the surrounded Germans. 200,000 men were arrested. On January 8th, the Soviets asked the Germans to surrender. They refused. On January 31st, 1943, Paulus was forced to surrender. More than 100,000 men stumbled into captivity, and only 5,000 would return to Germany. Stalingrad had been a bloody battle. The Germans were devastated, losing about 300,000 of their men and at least so many of their allies. The Russians lost approximately the same number, including thousands of civilians. It was Germany's largest catastrophe in the war so far, but it wouldn't be the last. The Red Army was now inflicting massive defeats to Hitler's forces throughout the Eastern Front. Stalingrad had been a great triumph for the Soviet army, and now his operational commander, Marshal Zhukov, he directed his attention to the German army group, still camped in the Caucasus. Soviet troops paved the way west of Stalingrad, and in early December 1942 were 120 miles from Rostov. There was a real possibility that all German forces in the south be cut off. With little choice, Hitler reluctantly gave the army group the permission to retreat. During the following month, the Germans fought a skillful rear action. Hundreds of thousands of troops withdrew. Then, on January 12, 1943, Zhukov launched a total attack. The Soviets attacked along a 500-mile front. Exceeded 7-1, von Manstein, the general commander of German forces in the region, fought a bright-moving withdrawal. But at the end of February, the Red Army had recaptured both Kursk and the neighboring city of Kharkov. This Russian winter offensive had broke a paralyzing blow to German power. In a matter of months, had lost 1 million men and vast numbers of tanks and weapons. The Red Army still had huge reserves of human power and was also benefiting from a large increase in weapons production and help from the United States and Britain. The Germans no longer had the superior technological advantage, the Tan-34. It was more than a match for Panzer IV, and they also had the terrifying Katyusha multiple rocket system, which shattered the German troops. However, Hitler refused to give up hope. He still dreamed of a preventive summer attack that would unbalance the Soviet Union and recover the initiative. The city of Kursk seemed the obvious place to start. Here, the Soviet attack had pushed a deep protrusion on the German lines. Looking at a temptingly exposed, Hitler has decided that he should be cut and annihilated. He also had an ace in his sleeve. German attack would be led by a new generation of German tanks specially designed to combat the formidable Russian T-34. The massive but slow 55 and D. Tiger had an 88 mm lethal cannon, and his front armor made him almost impermeable to the Soviet tank cannons. And then there was the fastest 43-ton Panther with a new 75 mm cannon, also able to knock out a T-34. These tanks were so new that Hitler was forced to delay the attack while enough numbers were manufactured and delivered ahead. This additional delay would give Soviets even longer to prepare, exacerbating the German strategic problems. Even while German forces began to gather, Soviet commander Marshal Zhukov guessed what was about to happen. Soon after, he received information from a Soviet spy inside the High German Command confirming the location of the attack. Zhukov ordered the construction of a series of defensive lines with anti-tank artillery, mined fields, and deep barbed wire belts. He also massively built the Soviet forces in the area, bringing troops and tanks of less vulnerable parts of the front. On the eve of the attack on Kursk, the Germans were enormously overcome by Soviet defenders, who also knew exactly when the Germans would attack. This situation represented a complete reversal of the advantages that had characterized previous German successes: strategic surprise, strength concentration, and temporal initiative. On July 5, 1943, just when German troops were preparing to attack, they were hit by a huge bombing of Soviet artillery. Even so, the next morning, the panzers still advanced, but this time they were against a well-entrenched enemy. There was no realistic chance of a lightning advance from Blitzkrieg. The results were disastrous for the German forces. In the north, the German army only gained 6 miles for the loss of 25,000 men and more than 200 tanks. In the south, the Germans did a little better, with a 25-mile depth wedge being dug into the Soviet defenses, but it was also expensive. 10,000 men were killed and 350 destroyed tanks. For a brief moment, it seemed that a German advance could be possible. Then Zhukov launched his reservations. On July 12, 1943, 900 tanks attacked the German flank. Almost 2,000 tanks have now been engaged in what was the largest armored battle of World War II. The T-34 Soviets penetrated the German lines and opened fire to the unlocked burning. After a single day of brutal combat, the Germans had lost 350 more tanks and retreating. Meanwhile, in the air, there was an epic battle. Eventually, the Soviet Air Force has established supremacy about Luftwaffe. Now, the Russians could trigger their formidable IL-2 Sturmovik tanks hunters. On July 23rd, the Germans had lost any ground they had gained, and with him the cream of his army. Hitler's adventure in Kursk cost him at least 50,000 troops and over 700 tanks. Never again, the Germans would launch an important offensive in the Eastern Front. The Russians had become the tide of war, and this turn represented more than a tactical change. It was the recognition that the German fundamental strategy had irreversibly failed. The analysis of Operation Barbarossa and its consequences reveals multiple layers of strategic error that have intertwined to create a catastrophe of historical proportions. In the first place, the ideological and racial assumptions that informed Hitler's decision to invade the Soviet Union created a fundamentally distorted framework for military planning and execution. Hitler's belief that the Soviet people, composed widely by those he considered subhuman, it would quickly disintegrate under military pressure, it turned out not only morally disgusting, but strategically disastrous. This systematic underestimation of the enemy permeated all aspects of German planning, from campaign duration to logistics preparations and provisions for winter combat. The question of logistics perfectly illustrates the structural problems of German planning. The German army depended on transportation heavily pulled by horses and railways, but Soviet railways used a different gauge from German, requiring conversion or load transfer. The German supply lines extended rapidly beyond their effective support capacity, creating vulnerabilities that would become critical as the campaign extended. The division of German effort into 3 main axes: Leningrad, Moscow, and Ukraine. It reflected both the grandiose ambitions of Hitler and its inability to establish clear strategic priorities. This dispersion of force prevented the decisive concentration that classical military doctrine demands for success. Each army group was strong enough to reach impressive tactical successes, but none had the concentrated force necessary to ensure a decisive strategic victory. Hitler's personal intervention in operational decisions represents another critical factor in Barbarossa's failure. His insistence on which Guderian's panzers deviated from Moscow to Kiev in the summer of 1941 exemplifies as political and psychological considerations can subvert military logic. Although Kiev's capture has resulted in an impressive tactical victory, the lost time was strategically fatal. The temporal issue was absolutely crucial to Barbarossa's fate. The campaign started approximately 6 weeks delay due to intervention in the Balkans, and these delays accumulated throughout the summer and autumn of 1941. When the Russian winter arrived, the Germans were still fighting for Moscow, their troops inadequately equipped to the severe weather and its stretched lines to the break point. The Soviet response to the invasion demonstrated both initial weaknesses and the eventual strength of Stalin's political and military system. The initial collapse of Stalin's organized resistance and temporary paralysis created a window of opportunity that the Germans effectively explored. However, the ability of the Soviet system to reorganize, mobilizing mass resources, and implementing a coordinated defense revealed resilience that German planning had failed to anticipate properly. The importance of Siberian reserves in the defense of Moscow illustrates as broader geopolitical factors influenced the campaign course. The Japanese decision of not attacking the Soviet Union in the east has allowed Stalin to transfer experienced and well-equipped Western troops at the critical moment. This forces movement represents a type of strategic flexibility that German planning had failed to consider properly. The role of military intelligence was another decisive factor. While the Germans reached tactical surprise at the beginning of the invasion, the Soviets gradually developed superior intelligence capabilities. Information needs German plans for. Kursk allowed the Soviets to prepare appropriate defenses and concentrate forces in a way that completely neutralized the German advantage in tanks technology. The Battle of Stalingrad represents a perfect microcosm of the broader German strategic problems. Hitler's decision to attack the city was mainly motivated by symbolic and psychological considerations rather than objective military needs. The fixation in capturing a city that beaded the name of its enemy transformed what could have been a secondary operation into a strategic obsession that consumed disproportionate resources. The German driving of the Battle of Stalingrad also illustrates the dangers of strategic microgent. Hitler's refusal to allow Paulus to try to escape the siege, based on unrealistic aerial replenishment promises, it has turned an operational defeat into a strategic catastrophe. The loss of the Sixth Army was not just a material blow, but a psychological shock that resonated through all the German war effort. The development of new military technologies during the campaign demonstrates how tactical innovations can influence strategic results. The Soviet T-34 tank proved to be superior to contemporary German models, forcing the Germans to develop new designs such as Tiger and Panther. However, these new German tanks, although technologically impressive, they arrived too late and in insufficient numbers to fundamentally alter the balance of power. The aerial dimension of the conflict also evolved significantly during the campaign. Early German air supremacy was gradually contested and eventually reversed as the Soviet Air Force reorganized and received new equipment. The loss of German air supremacy had deep tactical and strategic consequences, limiting the effectiveness of the Blitzkrieg doctrine and exposing the German land forces to Soviet air attacks. The issue of economic resources underlying the campaign reveals fundamental contradictions in German strategy. Although Hitler partially justified the invasion as necessary to ensure resources, especially oil, the reality was that the campaign consumed German resources at an unsustainable rate, while failing to capture promised Soviet resources. The oil fields of the Caucasus, when finally reached, were found completely destroyed by the withdrawals in withdrawal. The impact of the American entry on the war, precipitated by Hitler's declaration of impulsive war after Pearl Harbor, exponentially multiplied the German strategic challenges. Fighting now on multiple fronts against enemies with vastly higher industrial resources, Germany was forced to a defensive stance that fundamentally contradicted both its military capacities and its political ambitions. The evolution of Soviet military leadership during the campaign illustrates how organizational systems can adapt and improve under extreme pressure. Figures like Zhukov emerged as world-caliber commanders, developing doctrines and tactics that eventually equalized and overcome their German counterparts. This evolution contrasts markedly with the deterioration of the German command, increasingly dominated by Hitler's erratic interventions. The human dimension of the campaign, the massive suffering of civilians and soldiers on both sides, represents one of the deepest tragedies in modern history. The siege of Leningrad, with its hundreds of thousands of hunger deaths, exemplifies how strategic decisions translated into human suffering on an almost incomprehensible scale. These humanitarian consequences cannot be separated from strategic analysis, as they reflect both moral and practical costs of military decisions. Operation Barbarossa's failure had branches that extended far beyond the Eastern Front. The need to maintain large forces in Russia severely limited the German ability to respond to other strategic challenges, from the North African campaign to the defense of Western Europe against the eventual Allied invasion. This dispersion of efforts represented a fundamental violation of basic strategic principles. Propaganda and morals also played crucial roles in the campaign. German failure to capture Moscow and heroic resistance in places such as Stalingrad and Leningrad have transformed the war narrative of an inevitable German victories in an existential struggle, where Soviet victory became not only possible but likely. This change in perception had deep strategic consequences, affecting both German domestic morality and the disposition of potential allies. The question of atrocities committed by German forces during the campaign also had strategic consequences. The brutality of the German occupation has alienated populations that could initially have been friendly to the German cause, especially in Ukraine and in the Baltic countries. This alienation has transformed a war of conquest into an extermination war, motivating a more determined resistance and eliminating any possibility of negotiated agreement. The role of German allies, Romania, Hungary, Italy, and Finland, illustrates the complexities of military coalitions. Although these allies have provided additional troops, their limited military capabilities and divergent political motivations created vulnerabilities that Soviets have learned to explore, particularly in the later phase of the campaign. Technological evolution during the campaign also had broader implications for the conduct of war. The development of new weapon systems, from tanks to aircraft and artillery, was accelerated by the demands of the conflict. This arms race has consumed significant resources on both sides and influenced both tactics and strategies. The importance of communications and intelligence became increasingly apparent as the campaign progressed. The Soviet capacity to intercept German communications and the effectiveness of its international espionage network provided crucial strategic advantages. In contrast, German intelligence on Soviet skills and intentions has proven to be consistently inadequate. The climate impact on the campaign has transcended tactical considerations to become a key strategic factor. Russian winter was not merely an operational obstacle. but an element that fundamentally altered the balance of power among the combatants. German failure to prepare properly for winter combat reflected both strategic arrogance and inadequate planning. The industrial mobilization of both sides during the campaign demonstrates how prolonged conflicts become struggles of productive capacity as much as military skill. The Soviet capacity to relocate industries to the German reach while simultaneously expanded weaponry production proved to be decisive to the end result of the campaign. The diplomatic dimension of the campaign also deserves careful analysis. The German invasion of the Soviet Union forced a fundamental realignment of global alliances, bringing the Soviets to the anti-Axis coalition and creating the strange covenant between Western democracies and the communist state. This diplomatic change had consequences that extended far beyond the war in itself. In retrospective, Operation Barbarossa represents a case of classic study in how ideological factors can distort strategic judgment. The combination of racism, military hubris, and grandiose geopolitical ambitions created a reference picture that made failure almost inevitable. Effective military planning requires objective assessment of its own and enemy capabilities, something that Nazi ideology has made impossible. Barbarossa's legacy extends far beyond its immediate impact on World War II. The campaign has established standards for large-scale conflicts that influenced subsequent military thinking. The lessons on industrial mobilization, winter war, long-distance logistics, and centralized command versus decentralized remain relevant to contemporary strategists. Finally, Operation Barbarossa dramatically illustrates as individual strategic decisions can have monumental historical consequences. Hitler's choice to invade the Soviet Union not only changed the course of World War II, but fundamentally shaped the post-war world. The rise of the Soviet Union as superpower, the division of Europe and the subsequent Cold War can all be tracked in part to decisions made in the months before. June 22, 1941, the invasion that should have guaranteed German rule over Europe and established the thousand-year-old Reich became, on the contrary, the beginning of the end to the Nazi regime. In your search for Lebensraum, Hitler had found not the promised vital space, but the cemetery of his ambitions. Operation Barbarossa remains one of the clearest examples in history of how ideology, when divorced from strategic reality, can lead not only to military defeat, but to the complete destruction of the political goals that should supposedly serve.